Welcome to the Joshua Ngoma podcast for spiritual inspiration and Africa's strategy positioning in global politics.
Kenneth Kaunda, Zambia's founding leader. Zambia's independence struggle against Britain was for the most part bloodless. Rather, it was a massive campaign of civil disobedience based on Mahatma Gandhi's principle of nonviolence, except for a small but definitive rebellion called Cha-Cha-Cha. Like many Southern African states, Zambia's history was largely influenced by the presence of the British South Africa Company, BSSC, founded by a British national, Cecil John Rhodes. In 1888, Cecil Rhodes spearheaded British commercial and political interests in Central and Southern Africa and obtained mineral rights through concessions with local territorial chiefs. The country was initially partitioned into two separate territories, namely Northwestern Rhodesia and Northeastern Rhodesia. The two territories were combined in 1911 to form Northern Rhodesia with Livingstone as its capital. In 1924, Northern Rhodesia was put under direct British control as a colony, and the capital was subsequently moved to Lusaka in 1935. The BSSC's major attraction to Northern Rhodesia was the discovery of vast copper deposits in the area now called the Copperbelt province of Zambia. Mining in Zambia did not begin with the advent of the Europeans. For centuries, indigenous Africans mined there before on a subsistence level and developed metalworking techniques. The first commercial mine was opened at Ron Antelope, now Luanshya town, in 1928. The indigenous miners were an obvious source of labor by the new European miners. From their earnings, the indigenous miners were expected to pay a hard tax to the European settlers if they were lucky enough not to have been evicted from their own land. The European settlers sought for less dependence on the British colonial establishment by pushing for closer ties with Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and Nyasaland, now Malawi. To fulfill this goal, the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland was formed in 1953. In the 1950s and 60s, a wind of change driven by African nationalism was a growing phenomenon on the continent of Africa, and Zambia was part of it. In 1959, Dr. Kenneth Kaunda and Zambia's founding president formed the United National Independence Party, UNIP, based on Pan-African ideals. Dr. Kaunda and UNIP had a twofold mission: to establish abolish the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which promoted the rights of the European settlers at the expense of the indigenous Africans, and to seek independence from colonial rule. At the core of the controversy against the Federation were increasingly insistent African demands for greater participation in government on one hand, and European fears of losing political control on the other. Northern Rhodesia became the center of much of the turmoil and crisis associated with the last years of the Federation. The Federation was consequently dissolved on December 31st, 1963, and the following year, in 1964, Northern Rhodesia attained its independence and became Zambia. The British colonial establishment had profited immensely from the mineral wealth from Zambia. They instead chose to spend a huge portion of this wealth on the development of Southern Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. They built a significantly huge industrial, social, educational, and governmental infrastructure based in Zimbabwe. Zambia was the cash cow for the development of southern Rhodesia, and there was a stark difference in infrastructure development between the two countries. This is evidence to the fact that Zambia suffered a colossal loss of capital through a transfer of wealth born out of the sweat and hard work of Zambian workers from the Zambian mines. The British South Africa Company, BSSC, owned Zambia's mineral rights. Cecil Rhodes contracted Ron Select Trust, RST, and Anglo-America Corporation, ASC, to explore the mineral wealth on Zambia's Copperbelt province. The BSSC employed local Zambians cheaply and externalized all the profits from lucrative mineral prices. How Zambia nationalized the economy. At independence in 1964, Zambia faced huge challenges despite its considerable mineral wealth. Kaunda said, quote, "Since independence 5 years ago, Zambia has experienced the unhealthy combination of a sharp drop in labor productivity and a sharp increase in both prices and wages. The way we have been going in the past 5 years shows clearly that the majority of us have decided to make Zambia a nation of paupers or beggars." End of quote. With only about 100 university graduates and no universities of its own, the country had very few skilled and educated Zambians capable of running the government and the economy that largely depended on foreign expertise. There were very few schools, health facilities, and other basic infrastructure to cater for a growing population. In 1968, Zambia's first president, Kenneth Kaunda, raised concerns with the two companies that owned the copper mines. Ron Select Trust and Anglo-America Corporation had put in little new money in the mines since the country's independence in 1964. The companies argued that the new royalty system by which they were taxed dissuaded investment. It was apparent that the newly elected Kaunda government could not fulfill the aspirations of its people without a solid income base for the country. Hence, President Kenneth Kaunda boldly moved in the early 1970s to nationalize the mines, and the mining companies were forced to give up 51% of shares in the existing mines to the state. In 1982, the two nationalized RST and ASC combined and formed the mining conglomerate Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, ZCCM. The Anglo-American Corporation, through its subsidiary, the Zambia Copper Investments, ZC, continued to hold 27.3% of the shares. ZCI was also granted a preemptive advantage to buying back the shares that the government would offer in ZCCM at a later stage before they were offered to anyone else. Contrary to common opinion that this was a hostile takeover, ZCI was paid. The Development Corporation, ZCI, issued external negotiable bonds to pay for its shares in installments based on a December 31st, 1970 book value. Select Trust got $125 million and Anglo-American $175 million United States dollars. Earlier in August of 1969, President Kenneth Kaunda asked the owners of the mines to give up majority shareholding. He said, quote, "I do not think that the nation can achieve economic independence without acquiring full control of the existing mines," end of quote. The copper mines accounted for 95% of the country's export income and half the government's revenue. There was both political and economic pressure to this move. Zambia was still uncomfortably dependent on white Rhodesia on the south for trade and electric power. The cost of living was soaring, resulting in growing tensions between Zambia's blacks and the whites that constituted about 1.5% of the population. Recognizing the importance of the mines to Zambia, President Kaunda met with the president of Chile, Eduardo Frei, in 1967 to discuss an arrangement to help maintain world copper prices and quotas. Although there was no deal reached on price fixing, Chile's nationalization of its copper industrial base early in 1967 could have inspired President Kaunda to take similar steps in Zambia. In 1969, Zambia was classified as a middle-income country with one of the highest gross domestic products in Africa, 3 times that of Kenya, twice that of Egypt, and higher than that of Brazil, Malaysia, Turkey, and South Korea. With the income of the mines at government's full disposal, Dr. Kaunda managed to build a middle class in Zambia that was non-existent before. Under the colonial authorities, very little effort went into building more schools and hospitals. At independence, about less than 0.5% of indigenous Zambians had completed primary education. With increased national income, they managed to build schools, hospitals, and colleges across the country. They also managed to offer universal free education and a public healthcare system to every Zambian. A viable public school system became Zambia's bedrock to ensure that every child, regardless of their background, had equal access to an education from kindergarten to tertiary level. Education still remains the greatest equalizer and ought to be guaranteed as one of the most basic and fundamental human rights for every child. Today, Zambia boasts of thousands of university graduates. Through the mining sector, the government trained many Zambians for managerial positions and practical skills in engineering and technology. An indigenization program called Zambianization was implemented in order to take over from expatriate workers. In the process, Zambia produced a well-trained mining workforce capable enough to take care of its own affairs. By 1973, Zambia had an urban population of about 1 million out of a population of 4 million, and 750,000 were in full-wage pensionable employment. Socialism. Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and Julius Nyerere of Tanzania adopted socialism as opposed to capitalism as an ideal upon which they based their development of their new and young nations. President Felix Houphouët-Boigny of Ivory Coast adopted the capitalist model instead, but the economic outcomes were generally similar to those of Zambia and Tanzania. While colonial governments left a semblance of some infrastructure like some roads, clinics, a civil administrative service, and in some cases money in the treasury, much more was needed to cater for the rest of the populations. Kenneth Kaunda's brand of African socialism became known as humanism. It was a philosophy that identified the significance of man as being central to everything, stressing cooperation among people while condemning exploitation of man by fellow man. Julius Nyerere's brand was known as Ujamaa, a Swahili word defined as familyhood. Nyerere envisioned the unity of the rural village as the nucleus and building block for the whole society. On the other hand, leaders like Mobutu Sese Seko, who came after Patrice Lumumba in the former Zaire, were outright despots. The quest by some of Africa's founding leaders to uplift millions of people from perpetual doldrums of poverty remains unquestioned, and in the process, some strategic mistakes were made. In some cases, African socialism was tantamount to running a welfare state funded primarily by state owned enterprises. This model of economic development became unsustainable over time. Governments failed to meet their goals when inherited coffers from colonial authorities ran out. The situation was worsened by rapid population growth. International economic conditions changed, and many state owned enterprises suffered losses as returns diminished. There were extenuating circumstances both internally and externally that led to economic stagnation and failure of some African states in the early 1970s. Prices on commodities like copper plummeted, and the oil crisis of the mid 1970s externally affected the performance of the national economies. In the wake of the Arab Israeli Yom Kippur War of 1973, crude oil prices increased from $3 per barrel in early 1973 to more than $12 per barrel in 1974. The second oil shock came in 1979 when Iraq went to war with Iran. Crude oil went up from $19 a barrel in 1979 to $38 a barrel in 1981. Oil importing countries, including Zambia, saw their oil imports as a percentage of exports earnings rise from 4.4% in 1970 to 23.2% in 1980. The balance of payments was severely strained, and developing nations were forced to cut on imports of essential commodities and to raise prices on domestic goods. The agricultural sector was hit by higher fuel costs, expensive fertilizer and equipment, and many factories operated on lower levels because of a lack of imported inputs. As a result of the international recession of the 1970s, mineral producing countries like Zambia faced a huge slump in commodity prices, forcing Zambia to produce copper at a loss. These international events began to erode the major economic progress Zambia had attained in the first 10 years of independence and was now forced to borrow to maintain social programs. For the next 20 years, from 1974 to 1994, copper export prices continued to fall relative to imports like oil. The result was a downward spiral in per capita income to about 50%, making Zambia the 25th poorest country on the poorest countries in the world index. Internally, in Zambia's case, the copper mines became the main source of funding that government heavily depended on, but lacked many proper reinvestment and cutting-edge technologies. There was very little recapitalization in the new machinery, technology, and modern methods of mining. There was also a perceived political overreach in the running of the mines, and some of its resources went to support huge non-productive activities of the party and its government. Support for liberation struggles against colonialism in the Southern African region cost Zambia an estimated $20 billion and was likely billed to the mines. The support for liberation movements was not only noble but also needful, and it had to be done. But it still remains a debatable fact as to whether it was a prudent economic decision for a young nation to bear such a huge cost alone at the expense of much needed development for its citizens. By some modest estimates, Zambia's mines also were overemployed by an average of 3 workers for one job compared to other mining conglomerates like Chile's. Thank you for watching and listening. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Joshua Ngoma podcast. Bye for now until next time.